I welcome everyone this evening to our next talk on the history of the Jews of New London. It's an encore presentation because I gave the same talk about a month ago. So hopefully we have a few others that did not hear it from that time, and we'll give you an opportunity to hear the talk and also a chance to record it for posterity. But anyhow, now for me, it's really amazing to think that the first Jews arrived in New London in the 1600s. And now, over 350 years later, we still have 3 active congregations, one of each denomination. And also, we have a very involved Jewish community led by our wonderful federation, the Jewish Federation of Eastern Connecticut. And so let's go back to the 1600s. The first reference ever of a Jew setting foot in New London was in 1659, when a fellow named David the Jew was fined 60 shillings for illegal trading in the city. Now, it is said that he only stayed here a short while. I'm sure he didn't really spend a night, and then went back to Newport or New York, wherever he originated. But that was the first one. Then, a few decades later, in 1685, a Dutch ship called the Prosperous came to New London. Now, the ship came with a whole shipload of cargo and of goods to sell, and it was chartered by a fellow named John Carson, C-A-R-S-E-N, who was a Dutch Jew on the Dutch ship. Well, he was arrested because I don't know if they knew he was Jewish or not, but only English folks were allowed to trade in the colony at that time. But they let him go after a very short time because I think they figured out that he was born in England. So that made him a little more official. Now, the first Jewish community in Connecticut was in Stratford. And this was during the Revolutionary War era. Now, you have to remember that it was illegal to practice Judaism at that time. It was illegal to congregate. And because Connecticut, the colony, was founded by Puritans. And Puritans then evolved into the Congregationalists, the First Church of Christ, like on State Street in New London. They were the Congregationalists. And the original Connecticut charter stated that only that particular religion was allowed to practice in the state of Connecticut, the colony of Connecticut. And in fact, the official preamble to the charter said, the Commonwealth is to maintain and preserve the liberty and purity of the gospel of our Lord Jesus, which we now profess. So the Jews were clumped in with the Quakers, the heretics. It just was not a good environment for practicing other religions. So what happened? In 1818, they came up with the official constitution for Connecticut. They adopted the Constitution. Well, this only allowed other Protestant religions to practice, other Protestant denominations. It did not allow Jews or Catholics or what have you. That was finally permitted in 1843 when a constitutional amendment was passed allowing complete religious freedom for everybody. So it wasn't that long ago, and that's why you do not have Jews forming congregations or just even feeling welcome in the state of Connecticut. So the first real group of Jews as a group were the German Jews. The German Jews started arriving around 1860, just before the Civil War, and that immigration lasted till about 1876. The first name associated with the German group was Joseph Jacob Schwartz. He was the first Jew to make New London his home. Now, he started as a peddler, opened up a store, and finally a fancy clothing store on State Street. And Joseph Jacob Schwartz, his son, Frederick, was born in 1863, the first Jewish birth in New London. Now, as Jerry was hinting at last time, the German Jews were not particularly observant at all. I mean, they were really more reform. They only celebrated the major holidays, and of course, in people's homes. They did not have a formal shul. But if you needed kosher food, which even they did, wait a minute. Wait, bear with me a second, guys. Wait a minute. I'm going to share my screen, but I need to, I had it set up, but I lost it. All right. Give me half a second. This is silly. Here it is. Boing, boing, and boing. Okay. So what happened is the German Jews came and and what they did is the first thing they did was form a cemetery. You need to have a burial society because, I mean, every Jewish group has to have a place for Jewish burial. So as you may or may not know, they bought land in Cedar Grove Cemetery, the huge city cemetery for New London, not a Jewish cemetery at all, but the big city cemetery. And here is the property that was purchased by the German Jews. This was called, they formed what was called the Achim Shalom Society to do this. And they have this wrought iron fence around the thing. And there's lots of pieces missing if you go there today. But what I did is when I wandered around, I realized that there are something like 22 graves here. And of the 22 graves, many are children. So they opened the cemetery in 1878, and that's the year of the first burial. Now, in terms of the German Jews, the next major player, big shot, was a fellow named Joseph Michael. Now, Joseph Michael, first of all, was a peddler. Then he opened up a clothing store, but he was a real mensch. He helped many of the new arrivals get started. He got food for them, found them lodging, clothing, and this also continued with the Eastern European Jews that came a few years later. So Joseph Michael was a nice guy. And in fact, what happened is when he died, all the clothing stores of New London closed during the time of his funeral in honor of this man. Now, so as the German group developed, the first couple to get married in New London was in 1875. Not sure who it is, but it was in 1875. Now, another fellow to speak about is Samuel Goldsmith. Samuel Goldsmith, let me just 1 second. Well, before I get to that, before I get to Samuel Goldsmith, oh, here he is. Okay. Samuel Goldsmith started a store called the Beehive Store. It was a department store, the very first department store in New London. This is State Street, and for orientation, you can see this train station here. Here's Mariners Square offices. So anyhow, you all know the building. You may remember it well as Grant's, W.T. Grant's department store back in the day. So anyhow, that was Goldsmith, and he was a philanthropist. He was the first president of the Achim Shalom's Burial Society for the Cedar Grove Cemetery. But anyhow, the next thing you need but see, the thing is if they wanted kosher food, you had to go to either New York or Newport. You had to bring in kosher food for somewhere else. So wait, I'm actually ahead of the game. Sorry. And if you wanted to get married and have a Jewish wedding, you either went to New York or you brought the rabbi in from New York to hold the wedding. Now, but the problem was that the German Jews, the German population did not grow in New London. You know, they came here because there was a revolution in Germany. It was uncomfortable for them, but things actually got better in the mid 1800s. So by 1876, there were no further German Jewish immigrants. Those were here, and some probably went back to Germany. But so that was the end of the German immigration. But in 1885 started the Lithuanian group, the Litvaks. You know, we have the pogroms, we have the terrible situation in the Pale of Settlement. So the Litvaks started arriving en masse. The first Lithuanian Jew was Samuel Kott, C-O-T-T. And he, you know, what happened to this group is some of them had excellent trade skills. They were carpenters. They were tailors. I mean, my grandparents were all tailors from these countries. But basically, they had skills that were useful in the big mills, the silk mills and what have you of New London. But many of them were just unskilled laborers back in the old country. They were peasants. So they had a much harder time finding getting a foothold in the new world. The main part of this Lithuanian immigration took place between 1890 and 1892. But this group was much more intensely religious. I mean, they really increased the whole Jewish atmosphere in New London, much more so than the German group. And of course, they were much more Orthodox. So their services did not have any English, of course, and the men and women would sit separately. But you also needed kosher food if you're going to have a good Orthodox community. So here we are, 1894. Caliph Schwartz came here and opened up the first butcher market, kosher butcher market in New London. This was in the area just north of where the Holiday Inn is today, where the Radisson used to be. That was the big Jewish community, and the Schwartzes had their meat market. This is Lester, Shmuley, and Jake on the side. These are the grandsons, actually, of Caliph Schwartz. And the meat market continued in the family as a family business until 1995. So that's over 100 years of the Schwartzes running the kosher butcher. Now let's talk about the individual synagogues, the individual congregations. Now, with the Lithuanian arrival and this large influx, the first thing you need to do, just like the Germans, is form a burial society. And, you know, so what they did is they bought land in, the pictures are in the corner only. Well, you guys aren't seeing a full picture here? Are you seeing a full picture of the screen? Okay.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, good. All right. So anyhow, what happened is they formed the Orthodox Sick Benefit Society of Ahabad Hesed. And this started in July of 1892. To this day, this sign is still on the cemetery. It's actually, unless there's something I missed, this is the only sign identifying the Ahabad Hesed cemetery. But anyhow, so now we have a cemetery. But the population is growing, and now we need a synagogue. They need a shul. So 1905, the Jews from the Lithuanian community got together with even some of the Gentiles to put up money to build the shul, and they built this beautiful shul on Shapley Street. Shapley Street was 1 block north of Federal. Of course, that's all part of the what do you ever call it? The urban renewal now. But basically, Shapley was 1 block north of the back parking lot of the Holiday Inn, where we hold our services. So, and the guy that was in charge of building, getting the money together and organizing the building was a fellow named Philip Hendell. Philip Hendell was the father of Dr. Isidore Hendell that I've heard so much about. I guess he delivered many babies here and kept everybody in good health. But so anyhow, Philip Hendell was the organizer of this synagogue. But unfortunately, it burnt down in 1919. There was a big fire. The synagogue was destroyed. And at that time, the churches of New London, some of the churches offered their facilities so that the Jews from this congregation could continue their services. Luckily, right around the same year, the Methodist Church was moving. They were moving to a new building next to the courthouse. And so they offered their church for sale. So this is the building that Ahaved Hesed took over, and they remained here until 1968 when they moved down to Montauk Avenue. So here's a picture of the interior of the synagogue. I would assume maybe the women were sitting in the balcony up there. And this is what the synagogue looked like when it was still a church, actually. And of course, the long-term rabbi, Rabbi Sternberg, he must have come, I'm guessing, about 25 years ago. Seems like quite a long time. And he's done excellent things for the Jewish community of New London. I mean, obviously, he brought the Chabad organization here, the Chabad house, and, you know, he really keeps the Orthodox community and the rest of us, too, busy with their various activities, lighting the Hanukkah candles and on the parade, so many different things that they do. By the way, this picture was at Bethel, again, probably about 20 years ago, I'm guessing, maybe 15. This is Rabbi Sternberg, but that special weekend, we brought a Torah scribe, a sofer to Bethel to show us how the Torah is written. So here's Jerry Fisher with Rabbi Sternberg and the Torah scribe, the sofer from New York. Okay, the next shul I want to talk about. Oh, by the way, one last thing. I find this extremely interesting. When they dedicated their 1905 building, the New London Day had the following quote: "This synagogue, the first in the city, was indeed a special occasion for both Jew and Gentile. For the Jew, it marked an important milestone in his religious life. For the Gentile, it was an opportunity to witness the Jew in his religious surroundings, to see him as he really is, and not the unpleasant Shylocks of fiction and anti-Semitic literature." So that's how the Day wrote up the establishment of the temple, of the shul. So next we're going to talk about Ohev Shalom. Ohev Shalom, in the late 1800s, after the Lithuanians had arrived, now came the Ukrainians. And Ukrainian Jews mixed in with some Polish and Galicianers, but this was another large influx of Jews from the Pale of Settlement. Now, in 1895, they wanted to get together and form a congregation. So they would have their services in auditoriums, maybe people's homes, for the Ohev Shalom synagogue. And of course, then they decided, wait a second, why do we need to compete with the other Orthodox shul? Why can't we just merge together and do it as one? So in 1905, when Ahaved Hesed was opening their new building, the Ohev Shalom congregation moved in with them, and they tried it, but it didn't do too well. They found out that the Ukrainians had a very, very different liturgy. Their rituals, their traditions were different. Even their dialect was different. So by 1911, 6 years later, they split and formed their own Ohev Shalom synagogue. Actually, they formed their Ohev Shalom Sick Benefits Society. And they bought land right next door to Ahaved Hesed in Waterford, and that's their cemetery today. But they, as a synagogue, really didn't do well. Oh, by the way, let me go back. This is their building. When they decided to build their own building in 1919, I'm sorry, this was the building they put up. This is on Blinman Street. Blinman Street, as you probably know, sits between Bank Street and Truman. It's, if you knew the old Christopher Columbus statue, it's right behind the Christopher Columbus statue. So this is the building that they put up, and this is the building today. You might know it as the Centro de la Comunidad, the community center for the Hispanic community. Notice the Star of David is long gone, but the building certainly exists. So this was the Ohev Shalom. Now, if you recall also, their plaque was outside the small chapel at Bethel. And this was there until we closed at 660. But the only thing I take a little bit of, it's a little confusing to me, is this 1976, because I actually have all the paperwork for the merger. And I believe every piece of paper I have shows that it happened in 1973. But we're splitting hairs here. But it's interesting to see the names, of course, of all the old members of Ohev Shalom. Now, wait a second. I'm not. Okay. Now, New London has always been a vacation destination for the Jewish folks of Norwich, Colchester, Hartford, and as far as Springfield. And many settled in Neptune Park, right by the ocean, right by Ocean Beach. And they didn't want to schlep all the way into downtown New London to go to shul. So they, in 1925, they got together and formed Temple Israel. This is on Park Street, right near Ocean Beach. And this was built to cater to the summer residents. But it also, as many residents from New London started moving south to closer to the beach, this became an important summer shul, so they didn't have to travel all the way into New London. But anyhow, so this is Temple Israel. And of course, the main person we always associate with Temple Israel is Isidore Greengrass, Rabbi Greengrass, who was so dear and important to us at Bethel for so many years. And of course, he was a Holocaust survivor and had, wrote a whole book about how he escaped from the concentration camp into the woods and, and survived. And here he is helping out at one of the local weddings in New London. And by the way, if you don't recognize the woman, that's my lovely wife, Gail. And that was our wedding a long time ago. Now we come to Congregation Bethel. Now, in the 1920s, the population was growing, the Jewish population. And what they were really looking for, the younger folks, were looking for a less traditional form of Judaism, a more inclusive form than what they had with the Orthodox synagogues. So, and at the same time, the concept of conservative Judaism was growing in the country. So then they decided that they wanted to have conservative services. So the first place they had those services is this building on Union Street in downtown New London. This is the Union Lodge Hall. It's actually a Masonic lodge hall. And they started having services, I believe, on the second floor, just on the high holidays. But at least men and women could now sit together, and the sermon was in English. And this was a big step for New London. To give you an idea, this is another picture of the building today. Here it is on Union Street. This is the Crocker House here, and the tall telephone company building is on the other end of this street. So anyhow, that's where the first Bethel services were held. Now in 1930, I'll skip that for a second. 1932, a group of about 10 people got together to decide to organize into a formal synagogue. And that's how Congregation Bethel was formed. The big name at the time, the big organizer, was Nathan Lubau. And I believe he was the first president of Congregation Bethel. Now, they hired a rabbi. This was Rabbi Samuel Ruderman, who came down from Boston. Now, this man was 25 years old. He had just, finished his ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And so he came here, and he was our very first rabbi. He stayed until about 1941, till he went to Fall River, where he remained for the rest of his rabbinical career. But what they did is they needed a building. Now, this building was already established as a Jewish institution. It was called the Hebrew Institute, or in some way, a Jewish community center. This is on Blackhall Street. Blackhall Street's running this way, and here's Press Street. This building today is the Church of Reverend Hislop, Wade Hislop, but it was originally a Jewish institution. So this is where Bethel started, and I will speak more about that in just a moment. So in talking about the early days of Congregation Bethel, we have to talk about Ben Kaplan and his wife, Lena Kaplan. This is Ben. Now, there were two Ben Kaplans in town. If you remember from my other talks, there was the other Ben Kaplan had the furniture store on Bank Street. This Ben Kaplan was in the hardware business with Paul Agranovich's grandfather, Abe. So they had the Aben hardware store on Bank Street. But anyhow, this is Ben Kaplan, and he and his wife Lena were real mockers in the early days of the synagogue. And they only lived a block away. So this house is on Blackhall Street. So what they would do on Friday evenings is they would have Onyx Shabbat after the services in the White Building, and they'd come here for Onyx Shabbat. And on Saturday mornings or afternoons, they would have the Shabbat Kiddush in their house. So this was the Kaplans. Now, a year later, 1933, what does every Jewish group need? They need a burial site. So they went to Groton and organized a cemetery in Groton, which of course is our Bethel Cemetery today. But now we get to the 1940s. Everything is blossoming. I mean, the Jewish population is growing. Conservative Judaism is growing, during the war, but especially after the war, because now we have the baby boomers and, prosperity, and everybody's doing well after World War II. So they realized they needed a real synagogue, a real building, because you want a building where everybody could fit for the high holidays, where you can have weddings. You can't keep going to other facilities. So basically and also the Jewish population, this prosperous Jewish population, was moving to Plant Street, Thames Street, Montauk Avenue, and then later on to Admiral Drive and Glenwood. But basically, so they decided that they needed a building closer to where they were. So they originally, though, before they went to 660 and bought the land at 660, they purchased land behind the Buckley House, the Buckley School behind the statue of John Winthrop Jr. in New London. But when they realized they wanted to go south, they sold that land to St. Sophia's Greek Orthodox Church, and that's where their church stands today. So that land was originally Bethel's. Okay, so now they need a synagogue. So by 1951, they opened at 660 Ocean Avenue. And, the Jews, some of the Gentiles, everybody put up money for the synagogue. And even the other churches donated. Like, for example, the Methodist Church donated the 2 pulpit chairs at that time. The First Congregationalist Church, the First Church of Christ, donated a large menorah for the synagogue. And of course, we all remember this end as the social hall. And here was the library, the offices, and downstairs was the classroom, a few classrooms. But this was their main sanctuary, of course, because that's all they had when they opened the building in 1951. And of course, this is the Lena Kaplan Library. Lena Kaplan, Ben's wife, was the first, she founded the sisterhood and was the first president. And she had passed away a few years before here in 1947. So obviously they dedicated the library to Mrs. Kaplan. Now, here is our beloved Rabbi Astor. Rabbi Astor came here in 1981, I believe, from a pulpit in New Jersey, and he stayed until 2013 when he retired. So he was here for something like 32 years, and he did so much at Bethel. He was the the face of Bethel. He certainly officiated at 1 million bar and bat mitzvahs of all our kids, many of our weddings, including my own. And of course, he was our moil. He was the guy to go to if you needed a bris. So Rabbi Astor. Now, this picture, by the way, in case anybody's curious, is on the southern steps of the temple in Jerusalem. And getting bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah here is Shira Brooks, my stepdaughter. That's Gabe Fisher in the middle. And then Jacob Stern is hidden by the rabbi's hand. Or no, I guess his head is bent over here. So that was a bar mitzvah in Israel a few years ago. A few other rabbis at Bethel. This was Rabbi Leonard Goldstein. And he came around 1952, so shortly after the building was put up, and he stayed until 1970. I mean, to me, if you look at what I did is looked at all the pictures of Bethel on our website, mainly on our website, of all the classes of Hebrew school that graduated and all the confirmation classes, and you can see all the rabbis through the years. But so that was Leonard Goldstein, and then Aaron Perlstein was here right before Rabbi Astor. So, again, we can mention every single rabbi, but we'd be here all night. And I suggest that for a more comprehensive history of Bethel, please go to the website, go under about us, and you can see the full history of Bethel. Next, and of course, in speaking of Bethel, though, one person I do want to mention is Lou Detz. He was here for decades. He was our gabbai, our assistant rabbi. He made sure we all had our honors on the high holidays and made sure we were all seated properly. A very beloved fixture at Bethel. Now, Temple Emmanuel. Temple Emmanuel started when the folks got together in 1960 to form a Reformed temple. So they met first at the Mohegan Hotel and decided to go ahead with this. So in the beginning, they had their services from 1960 to 1968 in the All Souls Unitarian Church, I believe on the one on Huntington Street, right next to the courthouse. And so that was where they started. But then they bought a property in Groton. They bought the Bishop Seabury Church on Thames Street in Groton, and they stayed there for a bunch of years until they bought the property in Waterford. And interestingly enough, that church, or that building that was the synagogue in Groton, is now the Islamic Center of New London. But so it's been through various religions over the years. And of course, as we speak about Temple Emmanuel, we have to speak about Rabbi Rosenberg. He was here for 35 years as the spiritual leader of that community. So what amazes me is how well we've done over the years at keeping our rabbis here in New London. I mean, you have Rabbi Rosenberg here for 35, Rabbi Astor for 32, Rabbi Sternberg for a long time. So we must be doing something right to be able to enjoy these wonderful rabbis. Okay, now, for any Jewish group, Jewish education is paramount. Now, even for the very early Orthodox Jews in New London, what they did in the beginning is they had tutors. And the people that worked as peddlers during the day or worked in the various factories, at night, they would go around tutoring the Orthodox boys for their bar mitzvahs. The first bar mitzvah in New London was Louis Kott, who was the son of Samuel Kott, the first Lithuanian Jew. So he was the first one. Now, in 1914, B'nai B'rith organized a Jewish Sunday school in New London. So that was a big step. But I want to go back to 1901, when an organization developed called the New London Hebrew Ladies Aid and Education Society. And they were a social service group, but also a educational group, obviously. And they opened a Hebrew school, a Jewish school in New London. So by 1925, they purchased this building that I mentioned a moment ago, that became the Jewish Community Center, the Hebrew Institute. And they stayed there for years as the society until Bethel took it over in 1932 and combined the Sunday school with the religious school into one big organization. Now, the first bas mitzvah, we'll use the old term, in Bethel, or even in the community, was Rosanna Kaplan. And she was the daughter of Ben and Lena Kaplan, and that was in 1935. Now, in this building, by 1937, junior congregation could expect up to 100 children. I mean, this was a growing population here. And if we skip ahead to 660 Ocean, by 1955, there were 200 boys and girls in the Hebrew school. So then you had a superintendent, you had a board of education, and of course, a PTA. So that was significant. And then finally, in 1973, Solomon Schechter is founded. The Solomon Schechter Academy as the first and probably only conservative Hebrew day school in this area. And of course, that was run for so many years so well by Karen Rosenberg, and now it's in the good hands of Barbara Wolf. But that was the history of Hebrew education in New London. Another important thing to talk about is tzedakah, philanthropy, another big focus of the Jewish group. So 1938, you had the UJA, United Jewish Appeal, begin in New London. And by 1945, at the end of the war, they raised over $200,000 to support the effort for a state of Israel, so to support the Palestinian Jews. And this all morphed into JFEC, the Jewish Federation of Eastern Connecticut, in 1970. Now, one important thing about JFEC is that in their early years, they became a federally recognized refugee resettlement organization, agency, and they resettled hundreds of Russian Jews coming here in the 1980s. And of course, they even settled Katrina victims after Hurricane Katrina from 2005 that ended up in our area. Now, here is a very well-known Jewish family that came from Russia, I believe in 1989. Here is Michael Misha Rabinovich. Here's Helen Elparina. And, you know, the Vidonos family here. And I believe that's Rip Levin here as the sponsor for the federation of this group. So, you know, that was the resettlement. But the federation has done so many great things. I mean, run by Jerry Fisher for well over 30 years, 35 years, of course, with Romana Primus as the president of the board. But besides producing their leader every 2 weeks, they run the Hillel programs at Connecticut College, the Coast Guard, all the miraculously wonderful senior programs to support all the seniors in the area, the food pantries, and of course, programming. But as we know, when Jerry retired, Karen Savell took over, and she has done another remarkable job with the Federation, bringing vigor and activities and programming. We always loved the programming that she was able to establish here too. Especially, remember, we all went to see Dr. Ruth. But anyhow, that was the Federation. Now, another major movement in New London from the turn of the 20th century was Zionism. And Zionism began here, for the most part, in 1906, when a fellow named Isaac Resnikoff arrived and formed a Zionist organization. And this, of course, was the father of Izzy Resnikoff that we talked about from the Bank Street days. They had a clothing store on Bank Street. But anyhow, 1913, though, another young man, Morris Malov, started the second Zionist organization called the Sons of Zion. And they got some money together. They purchased land in the Jezreel Valley of Israel near Afula to have a Jewish settlement sponsored by the Jews of Eastern Connecticut. So, a very active group. And of course, in 1925, they organized into something called the United Palestine Appeal. Well, 1947 comes. After World War II, the war was over. We're in a military community. We have a big military institution called the Naval Subbase. Well, they had a lot of surplus goods after the war. So what they did is, I believe under the auspices of Harold Weiner, they bought a lot of goods from the Navy and managed to slip it past the British blockade to Palestine to help the Jews in their fight for a state of Israel. Now, also, next we want to talk about Holocaust Remembrance. And of course, we have to talk about it here because of our esteemed congregant and New Londoner, Sigmund Strachlitz. Sigmund was a Holocaust survivor, along with Elie Wiesel, his good, very, very good friend. And Sigmund came here in 1957 to purchase the Ford dealership from David Elfenbein. And once he came, he established New London as one of the first cities in Connecticut to have a, and also Connecticut is one of the first states in the country to observe a National Day of Remembrance for the Holocaust. And then eventually he got all 50 states to observe a Holocaust Memorial Day. And as you know too, Sigmund Strachlitz was instrumental in organizing the National United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. So again, a very, very significant man. Now, his best buddy or dear buddy was Elie Wiesel. Now, in my day, I came here in the 83, I can still remember Elie Wiesel coming to Congregation Bethel to chant the Haftorah on certain occasions. And of course, he came here at the invitation of Mr. Strachlitz. And also, when Elie Wiesel went to Stockholm to receive his Peace Prize, the Nobel Prize for Peace, Sigmund Strachlitz was right there with him. Now, in case you're wondering, or it looks a little familiar, the third man in this picture back here is George C. White, the founder of the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center. Now, we did have anti-Semitism in New London. 1939, vandals knocked over tombstones in I believe in the Harvard Hesed Cemetery, and they painted swastikas on some of the stones. They put out a reward notice, but they never found the culprits who did this. Now, the New London Country Club in Waterford, which is now the Great Neck Country Club, would not allow Jews to be full-time members. Also, the Thames Yacht Club would not allow Jews to be members. Even Abraham Rubicoff, our state governor, our state senator, he could only be an honorary member of the New London Country Club. Obviously, that's all different today. Now, let's talk about Rubicoff for a minute. Abraham Rubicoff, as I said, was a major politician or a Jewish politician, but he had a home in Neptune Park, right on the ocean on Mott Avenue. Well, he was good buddies politically and friendly with JFK. And it's said that for the 1960 presidential campaign, Bobby Kennedy and Rubicoff would meet on the back porch of his home on Mott Avenue, facing the ocean, to discuss the campaign and set up the campaign. So that's Mr. Rubicoff. Now, this is another one of my favorite topics here. This building is the Workmen's Circle building, the Arbiter Ring. The Workmen's Circle organization was started in the 1890s in New York City as a mutual aid society. The conditions were terrible for the new immigrants in New York. I mean, everybody was packed together. They worked in the sweat houses. Life was just terrible. So this group called the Workmen's Circle formed to make life better. But they also, well, they were pretty radical too. They were a real hardcore socialist group that raised a few eyebrows with their radical thoughts. But here and across the country, they really promoted the Yiddish language. They felt that was so important. They started Yiddish schools. They wanted to teach Yiddish writing, speaking, and even had lectures purely in Yiddish. So in New London in 1907, the Workmen's Circle group formed with a Yiddish school on Tilley Street. But now in 1929, they buy this land on Jefferson Avenue. You've driven past it a million times. It's across the street from what's now Granite Plumbing Supply, but used to be the New London and Mohegan Dairies, which I believe was run by Walter Baker from Congregation Bethel. But basically, this was the Workmen's Circle. And they had, this was one of the first classes there in 1929. And if anybody's interested, I have the names for most of these kids, which are names you would recognize from New London. But, you know, the building, the organization didn't do that well. By 1929, they had lost the building to the bank. And who purchased it? In 1940, it was purchased by St. Sophia's Greek Orthodox Church. So it's funny how the Jewish organizations were just one step ahead of the Greek Church. Now, the other thing, we had Jewish war veteran chapters here in New London. This is Williams Park. The Federation is back here. This is a beautiful park by the Federation. Here's a stone wall they put up and a monument in 1961 dedicated to those who gave their lives in the various wars. And also in Harvard Hesed Cemetery in 1996, they put up a stone to commemorate another Jewish war veterans chapter. So that was the Jewish war veterans. And of course, Hadassah. Hadassah has always been very active in New London. It is said that Ruth Soltz, part of the Soltz kosher butcher family, went up to Boston in 1915 and heard a lecture by Henrietta Soltz. And then she came back to New London and formed what is thought to be one of the first Hadassah chapters in the country right here in New London. In terms of the economic life of New London, the Jews have always had a big footprint and played an important role. The first Jewish doctor in New London was a fellow named Emanuel Henkel. Emanuel Henkel opened his office in his home on Federal Street in 1990. And he was a family practice, general practitioner. He was a medical examiner, and he also was elected to the Board of Education. It is said that in his career, he's delivered over 7,000 babies, which is a feat that I don't even come close to. But anyhow, his son, Edward Henkel, was also a city manager in New London for many years. The first lawyer in New London was Max Boyer. In 1909, he opened his practice on State Street, and right around the same time as Perry Hollandersky that we spoke about from the Bank Street talks on the Hollandersky family. Politicians, we've had many Jewish politicians. Janet Polinsky, of course, was our representative for so many years in the State House in Hartford. Andrea Stillman, similarly, was our state senator, and both of these women were major powerhouses in Hartford. We've had 3 Jewish mayors, a fellow named Samuel Selnick, Harvey Malov, and Moses Savin, the father of Henry Hank Savin. But I want to talk about one more gentleman, Victor Norman. Victor Norman was a musician and an orchestra leader. He escaped Norway right before the Nazi invasion in 1938 and made his way to New London in 1940. Once he came here, he started the Eastern Connecticut Symphony Orchestra. And for 35 years, he was the conductor and head of that orchestra. And he was also our Bethel organist for 46 years. So he was, again, major player in the music world in New London. And there's, again, I could speak about people forever, but these are some of the folks I wanted to talk about as far as the history of the Jews in New London. So I thank you all for listening. I'm glad we got a chance to get this in. Thank you. And you can open it up for any further questions or comments. I know we only have a few minutes till Minyan, but I'd be glad to see what other thoughts you folks may have.
Very much.
You're very welcome.
I was just going to ask you to stop sharing, so thank you for doing that. And,
okay, you're welcome.
Anybody Stan, has a great presentation. Thank you, and your research is impeccable.
Okay, thank you so much. I enjoy it. I get a big kick out of it, especially tracing who's who in the various families. You know, who the children are, and you know, it's just amazing what you can find on the internet.
Stan, you had mentioned the United Palestine Appeal,
right?
And lo and behold, I have an original booklet from the 1926-1927 campaign.
Wow, great job, Robert.
Palestine Appeal.
Wow, anybody we know in there?
This would be national level. This is from New York.
Wow, that's great. I mean, so I wasn't making this stuff up. These things really do exist. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. You know, Zionism was so critical in those days. I mean, we didn't have a state of Israel, and everybody was very supportive of it.
But there was quite a schism in those days too, between the Louis Brandeis division of the Zionists and those that were by Chaim Weizmann.
Oh, okay.
There was the assimilationist group and the political group, and the group that was headed by Brandeis did not want to have a. They felt that assimilation was the key to Judaism, whereas Weizmann's group said they should be political, and their role in Palestine should be in taking a role as being the political, you know, become the power in the British Mandate.
Okay, very good. And we can think of Harvey again, Morris Mallop, Harvey's father, as being a major organizer here in New London for that. Yes.
I'd like to make a comment about the Saltz brothers.
Go ahead.
I believe it was Seymour who never got married.
The only one that ever got married was Jake.
Oh, Jake. Okay.
Jake was the only one that married, I believe.
Well, okay. Well, in that picture, when you had the picture of the three Saltz brothers, the person in the middle, he never got married, but he learned opera. And he happened to have sung opera very well.
Right.
And if you went into their store when they still had it, and I was a regular there, there would be a person who was of Italian descent who would come in and who was a customer, and they would spontaneously break out into operatic duets. It was something that if they had something like a smartphone in the 1980s, I could have filmed it, and I'm sure if I put it on my Facebook page, it would have gone viral because it was such a glorious, joyful, spontaneous thing to experience in a kosher butcher shop.
I think that was Shmuley, or
that was Shmulik.
Shmuley, I believe, right, Lena? Rena? Is that right?
Yeah.
Samuel was his real first name. I forgot. I think it was Samuel.
Yeah, but that was very exciting, and their meat was good, and it was always an experience to shop there.
Oh, absolutely. And Gail remembers them taking them into the freezer to show them the meat hanging from the hooks and everything.
Oh, I remember that.
They knew that my father was a butcher. My father was a kosher butcher. So they always wanted to show me the cuts of meat in the freezer. They didn't know that I couldn't stand the sight of meat. And they'd always bring me into the freezer to show me where my meat was coming from.
When I would go in, and I have no idea where this started, they would start quoting the Aeneid in Latin. And we would just see who could remember, who could go furthest into it. I'd never win, of course, but it was a lot of fun.
Wow. Sally and I also had the honor of entering the Saltz meat locker to see hanging meat.
Yeah, thanks for the memory, Stan. I
can't imagine.
Yeah, that was great. That was great.
They also had all this ivy covering all of the windows. Everything was surrounded with ivy when you came into the store. And in fact, there was a write-up in the New London Day about the ivy-covered kosher butcher shop in New London.
And if you remember from my last talk, that that butcher shop on Bank Street was the site of the early firehouse that was destroyed in 1938 before they moved across the street. So, but that was when that store was built. But of course, they were also behind Bank Street too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. All right. I don't know if we got.
This was really wonderful, Stan.
Oh, well, thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Stan, thank you so much.
All right.
It's obvious you did a lot of research, and anything that brings us back to New London to see our old friends, I really enjoy, and I could have listened to you for hours as well.
Well, thank you for joining us, Karen and Alan.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great to see your all your faces, and someday we'll all do the. Now, I would love next year to be able to walk everybody up State Street and point out all the buildings and scenes on State Street. I've done it before, but you know, it would be great to do given our environment. So
let us know when. We need 3 hours to get there.
Yeah. We'll do it on Zoom. I'll get my pictures together and we'll do it on Zoom like this one. So, all right. Good night, everybody.